我们下面介绍第四节，也是迈克尔·哈特森教授他的这个讲课中的这个一个很重要的话题。他说呢，第四节呢标题呢叫做“金融化房地产地租对工业资本主义的摧毁”。这是一个很吊诡的话题啊。这个金融化跟房地产地租什么关系？为什么这个地租对工业资本主义是摧毁？其实就是说实体经济怎么在美国这样的国家衰败，它这个过程是怎么回事儿？其实这个我因为是80年代中期吧，到美国去学习的，整个美国实体产业衰败的过程，我们是应该说有这个有些观察吧，因为我十几次去美国，从80年代以后啊，是最近这几年才不再去了。那对它这个实体产业衰败的过程呢，应该说有些直观的认识。当然，一方面呢是大家都知道这个农业占比很低，农业地租呢不再重要，但是在工业化发展的过程中间，随着大量的这个收入啊，通过税收啊形成财政啊，再进一步通过财政发债来大规模推进这个基本建设，而导致呢基本建设所带动的房产的价格大幅上涨。其实就是因为基本建设提高了什么呢？提高了一个极差地租。原来你没有，你比如说没有通高速路，那这个相对来讲镇这一级的地产价格就很低。那城里边比如没有通地铁，那市这一级的地产价格也很低。那一旦通了路或者通了地铁，基础设施条件得到了根本改善，立刻首先应声上涨的就是地价和房租。那当然地价也转到这个房价，那房价呢转化到租房者必须交纳的房租。也就是说，这些呢都不在生产过程之中，都是在生产。他说的所谓工业资本主义，就是实体经济了。我们今天叫做，就是实体经济没有开展生产之前，任何人你都得先交了房租才能住房。所以它客观上就是基本建设带动了房地产价格的上涨，房地产价格上涨带动了房租的上涨。那因此呢，人必须就是你还没有干活之前，你先得交了租，你才能住房子。那一样啊，就是你这个要想开个店铺啊，或者开个餐馆，你没有进入你这个业态之前，你也得先租啊。我租了房子才能开啊。于是说，它就是这个阶段就导致什么呢？导致这个房租被基本建设导致的极差地租抬升。那因此呢，就导致实体产业预先要支付，就没有进入生产之前啊，你先得付一笔钱，那这个开支就会很大。于是说，它就因租的上涨而导致实体经济的衰败。它讲的是这么个道理。
Today, obviously, rent isn't based on farming anymore. You have agriculture falling to only 3% of the American GDP. Urban housing is where most of the real estate is. The value of New York City real estate is larger than the depreciated value of all of the plant and equipment and machinery in the United States. The economy is all about urban real estate. That means that the most wealth in terms of net worth in America is created by rising real estate values. I don't know what the ratio is for China, but I would be very interested in seeing how much of Chinese wealth comes from rising real estate values compared to the rising value of factories and industrial capital and means of production. Well, I'll give you an example of how rental value is created in the modern world. In London, city government spent £3.4 billion to extend the Jubilee Tube Line out to Canary Wharf, the financial district. And the effect of making a subway line all the way outline was to increase the value of land all along the route by over £10 billion. So the entire England didn't have to borrow money or raise taxes. England, the entire cost of this public construction could have been defrayed by taxing the land's increased rented location, the unearned free lunch. Instead, London taxed wage earnings and profits. So taxpayers had to bear the cost, and landlords got a free ride. The same kind of rental location occurred in New York City a few years ago, when New York City built a subway line along the 2nd Avenue on the Upper East Side, which is where most of the rich people live. The subway cost about $3 billion to build. Took many years. Rents and property prices all along the route, as soon as the subway opened, they rose by $6 billion. In other words, the landlords, now that they have transportation and people don't have to walk a whole mile to the overcrowded Lexington Avenue subway, they could take the 2nd Avenue subway, and they were willing to pay much more for apartments. And so landlords made it a killing, $6 billion. The increase in this rent valuation was twice what it cost the city to build the system, and yet the city borrowed money, went into debt, raised income taxes, raised property taxes on homeowners when it didn't have to. It could have simply recaptured the free rental of location that it caused, that it created by building the subway line, but it didn't do it. Because New York City's run by the landlord class. That's why even if you have a mayor that isn't personally corrupt, like Mayor Koch, he brought into his administration the real estate courts are run by crooked judges, crooked referees. I've been in the courts. The landlords run the city for its own benefit, and the result is that New York City is gentrified. What do landlords want? They want high rents. The first thing landlords in New York City wanted was what the real estate class wants in America. They want to get rid of industry. New York City deliberately got rid of its industry. It used to be, there were a lot of manufacturers here, not importers, electronics industry, a lot of retail sales. All of that was gotten rid of. And factory buildings and loft buildings that were used to produce goods and services, printing companies, they were gentrified into loft. I bought a loft, what had been a printing company, for $20,000 in 1980. Less than 2 years later, I sold it for $580,000. That's how much wealth was created by getting rid of industry. To America, this was wealth creation. But what it did was create landlord wealth. Anybody now who wants to buy housing in New York or to rent housing, if you rent housing, it costs $4,500 a month for housing. Well, you can imagine nobody could work as a hand worker here, paying $4,500 a month to produce goods and services to compete with what Chinese labor is paid. So rent has been pricing New York out of the market. Who's buying these apartments? Financial people, Wall Street people, and the lawyers, because in Wall Street, you make your money the old-fashioned way, like Donald Trump is, by cheating people. You don't pay the workers, you don't pay the suppliers, you make them sue you. I won't get into stories about crooked New York law firms and landlords, but it's the way that you create wealth is to create the kind of society that will produce a lot of billionaires, but the rest of society will be poor. And obviously, this is what China needs to avoid. You don't want to create a lot of real estate billionaires and bankers getting rich and lending to Chinese people who are buying their houses, getting all the rental value just for themselves and interest. You don't want this financial intermediary class. Bus and subway lines obviously are going to increase the land site value. And Thorstein Veblen, a century ago, a great American economist who is called a sociologist because he talked about the big picture, which economists don't talk about anymore. He described urban politics as being concerned mainly with civic improvement projects to promote real estate values by land speculators. And this is true all over American politics. The aim of public infrastructure spending is to increase land prices to real estate developers. So if the developers run the cities, they're going to create improvements that help the value of the land that they're selling, and then they're looking for someone to buy the land at a higher price. So obviously, most land prices are going to get up in neighborhoods that are more desirable. Who's going to get the benefit of these improvements? The bus lines, the subway lines, the schools, and the parks. How should cities, whether you're in China or America, how should cities and municipalities pay for the cost of improving the means of transportation and making neighborhoods better? What seems most fair is to finance such improvements by taxing back the increased rental value. You want the city to be able to essentially create this freely and for nothing. And if the city does not tax the increased rental value that its transportation and parks create, then you're going to get existing landholders rich, and the bankers are going to be able to make more and more money lending to people who rent or who buy these apartments and pay the mortgage with interest. So all of a sudden, having richer private ownership of real estate rents makes the country poor because it deindustrializes the country. And that's what is called rent deflation. And Ricardo warned that this was going to be Armageddon. In other words, this is going to destroy industrial capitalism. If you don't prevent rents from rising, then you're going to have profits cut. And what Ricardo wrote was, quote, "The natural tendency of profits is to fall. For if in the progress of society and wealth, the additional quantity of food required is obtained by the sacrifice of more and more labor." Well, you could also say that now the additional access to housing requires more and more labor, more and more wages. And Marx spent volume 2 of his theories of surplus value reviewing all of the theory of economic rent that preceded him and led up to Marxism. And Marx's theories of surplus value, even though it was compiled after he died by Karl Kautsky, was really the first history of economic thought that was written, and it remains the most detailed discussion of classical value and price theory that ultimately led to Marxism and explained the class rivalries, the class conflict that developed by his day. And as Marx summarized Ricardo's theory, he wrote, quote, "The capital that can be applied with a profit would be reached at the point, the limit to the capital that could be applied with a profit would be reached at the point where food prices and the associated wage levels were so high that the employment of industrial labor no longer would provide the industrialist with a profit. The economy and its population at that point would reach its upper limit, and new capital investment and employment would stop." And Ricardo had said, you can see what's a description of what's happening in today's chronic debt deflation and rent deflation, already written by Ricardo. He wrote a third edition of his Principles of Economy, came out in 1821, 4 years after the first version. He wrote, you can postpone this lack of profitability, this deindustrialization. You can postpone it by the improvements in machinery connected with the production of necessaries, as well as discoveries in the science of agriculture, which enable us to relinquish a portion of labor that's required. And therefore, we can lower the price of the prime necessary of the labor, meaning food. But the rise in the price of necessaries and in the wages of labor is limited. For as soon as wages should be equal to the whole receipts of the farmer, there must be an end of accumulation. If no capital can then yield any profit whatever, and no additional labor can be demanded, and consequently population will have reached its highest point. Long indeed before this period, the very low rate of profits will have arrested all accumulation and almost the whole produce of the country. After paying the laborers will be the property of the owners of land and the receivers of taxes and tithes. Well, today it's not the landlords that receive the profits only; it's the creditors to the landlords. So Marx wrote, "This, as Ricardo sees it, is the bourgeois twilight of the gods, the day of judgment." Unquote. Ricardo warned that rising land rent was a great threat to industrial capitalism's survival. And it is again today. Despite the increase in technological productivity, real estate, and other natural resources, more and more rent is in the hands of rentiers, landlords, and creditors. And so rent is increased the margin of price over value. In other words, if you look at the labor needed to produce the goods and services you use, not growing anywhere near as rapidly as prices are going up. Prices are going up because you're paying a rentier class, you're paying a landlord class, you're paying a financial class, and the economy is being financialized, and that is what has ended industrialization in the United States and shifted the production of industry away from North America to China. That's why you don't want the same thing to happen there that's been happening here. All economic rent is, by definition, unearned to the extent that it's not based on necessary cost of production. So land rent, natural rent, and monopoly rent have no cost of production any more than air mineral rent or monopoly rent. Alfred Marshall, late in the 19th century, in 1890, explained quasi-rents in industry, and obviously some in manufacturing is done more efficiently in some countries or some producers in others, and you have differential rent in industry that's much more important than differential rent in farming.